I did not know his name for the first 4 years. That is the thing I cannot explain to the council without watching their faces go still with something like shame, not regret, not exactly, but the particular quiet of people who have realized they missed something large while looking the other way. I did not know the name of the man who kept my sister alive. I saw him every fortnight when I descended to the vault for my allowed viewing hour, and I passed him the way you pass a pillar or a ventilation grate, noting his presence because it required a small adjustment to my stride, then forgetting him entirely before I reached the upper steps. He was the cryo-vault maintenance technician. He wore a gray coverall with a name patch I never read. He carried a diagnostic kit with a scratched handle, and he smelled faintly of the coolant compounds they used to stabilize the older pods. Ushavel's pod was one of the older ones. They had done that deliberately, given her the older equipment, the kind that required more checking, more manual inspection, as if hoping one missed interval would do quietly what the council lacked the nerve to order openly. I understood this later. I understood most of it later. The Thorne family has ruled the Vareth seat for 9 generations. I say this not to impress but to explain the weight of what the council did in the 43rd year of my mother's reign, in the 6th month after my mother died. Ushavel was the elder daughter. The succession was hers. The council had other preferences, a preference for a regent who would listen, a regent whose temperament they had spent years mapping and finding agreeable. I was 22. I was agreeable. I did not know yet what agreeable cost. They came to me with a medical framing. They always come with medical framing when they want to do something that cannot survive a direct naming. Ushavel had a condition, they said, a rare vascular complication, newly diagnosed, dangerous to leave untreated. Cryopreservation would arrest the progression. 6 months, perhaps a year, while their medical team identified an intervention. I believed them. I want to be precise about that. I believed them completely. I signed the authorization with my own hand, and I watched them wheel my sister through the vault doors, and I told myself it was temporary. The first year I visited her pod every week. The second year fortnightly. By the third year I had accepted what I had been told, that the condition was more complex than anticipated, that the medical team was still working, that Ushavel herself would want me to govern rather than grieve. I accepted all of it. I was very good at acceptance by then. Acceptance was another word for agreeable, and agreeable was what kept the council from turning their medical framing toward me. It was in the 3rd year that I first noticed the technician was still in the vault when I arrived. I had always assumed the maintenance checks were on a rotation, a 10-minute interval, quick diagnostics, then the technician moved on to the next pod in the row. The vault held 47 pods. There was always one technician on duty and one supervisor at the upper station. The schedule should have had him moving. It should have had him anywhere but beside Ushavel's pod with his diagnostic kit closed and his back to the corridor, talking. I stopped. He did not hear me stop. The vault insulation is considerable, and I had learned to walk quietly in that place because loudness felt wrong there, felt like an intrusion on something between the sleepers and the cold. I stood at the corridor intersection, and I watched him lean forward slightly on the railing, his forearms resting on the barrier bar, and I watched him speak to the pod. I could not hear him. The insulation and the distance were too much. But I could see the movement of his jaw, the slight forward inclination of his head, the way his posture had the ease of a man continuing a conversation he had started some time ago rather than beginning one. He was not performing. He was not checking a readout or logging a note. He was talking to my sister the way you talk to someone who is temporarily unavailable but will, when they return, want to hear what was said. I left before he noticed I was there. I told myself it was a quirk, a technician with a sentimental streak, or perhaps someone working through his own grief, using the vault's silence as a kind of confessional. It happened among the maintenance staff sometimes. The sleeping held a quality that encouraged it. I told myself it was nothing. But I came back the following week instead of the following fortnight, and he was there again. He visited her pod, I eventually calculated, every shift he worked. Sometimes the visits were 5 minutes, a quick check, a few words, the diagnostic kit opened and logged before he moved on. Sometimes, especially in the late cycle shifts when the vault was quiet and the supervisor was occupied upstairs, the visits were 20 minutes, 30, once that I witnessed nearly an hour. He brought nothing to these extended visits. No chair, no reading material. Just himself and his closed kit and the slow weight of whatever he was saying, leaned out over that railing with the blue-white light of the stasis field touching the side of his face. I asked the vault supervisor about him at the end of the 3rd year. The supervisor looked briefly puzzled, as if I had asked about the condition of a ceiling panel. "Morrow," he said. "Cale Morrow, one of the maintenance techs. Good worker, thorough. He's been on the old equipment rotation for about 2 years now. Any concern with the pod performance?" There was no concern with the pod performance. Usavel's pod, despite being old equipment, had the cleanest maintenance record in the vault. Every check logged on time. Every deviation flagged and corrected within the hour. The supervisor mentioned this with a mild pride that I understood was not entirely his to claim. I did not speak to Cale Morrow that year. I watched him twice more through the corridor intersection, and then I stopped watching, because watching felt like taking something that wasn't mine, and I didn't have the courage yet to simply ask for it directly. But I stopped thinking of him as a pillar or a ventilation grate. I started thinking of him as a fact, a quiet, improbable fact sitting in the middle of everything else I was learning to doubt. In the 5th year, the council made a mistake. They brought in a new medical consultant, someone from outside the Varath system, presumably someone who had not been briefed on the political architecture of Usavel's situation. He reviewed the records, asked questions I could see the council finding inconvenient, and submitted a report that the vault supervisor's assistant filed incorrectly, in the open registry instead of the sealed council archive. I read it before anyone corrected the filing. I read it twice. There was no condition. There had never been a condition. The cryo-authorization I had signed was based on a fabricated diagnosis, and the medical team assigned to develop an intervention had been dissolved 18 months after Usavel was frozen, their work never having existed in the form I had been shown. The vault supervisor's record, the one with Cale Morrow's maintenance logs, contained, if you read it carefully, 7 years of evidence that a human maintenance technician had been the only person in this palace, consistently treating Usavel Thorne as a person who would one day wake up. I went to the vault that night, not during visiting hours. I used the Regent's override, which I had never used before for anything personal. It was the first time I had entered the vault after the main lights cycled down, and the blue-white stasis glow was different in the dark, softer, more present, like a held breath. I walked to Usavel's pod, and I stood where Cale Morrow had stood on every shift for the better part of 7 years. I did not know what he had said to her. I still don't. He has never repeated it, and I have never asked, because some things are not mine to inventory. But I understood, standing there in the dark with the light on my sister's face, that whatever he had said had been worth saying. That he had decided, alone, without permission, without any expectation of being noticed, that the woman in that pod deserved to know the world was still going on outside her. That someone was still paying attention. That she had not been simply filed away. I stood there for a long time. Then I went back upstairs, and I began the work of ending what the council had built. It took 8 months. I will not detail every step here. The gathering of documentation, the careful conversations, the identification of which council members had known from the beginning and which had been kept partially ignorant, and might therefore be persuaded to act with something like conscience. 8 months of work that I conducted in the open, because I had learned that the most effective thing I could do with my agreeableness was let people continue to underestimate what I was capable of when I had a reason. Cale Morrow I finally spoke to in the 7th month. He was coming off a late shift when I caught him in the corridor outside the vault entrance, coverall showing the day's work, diagnostic kit in his left hand, the particular tiredness of someone who has been on their feet for 8 hours in temperature-controlled air. He stopped when he saw me, not with surprise exactly, with the expression of someone who has been expecting a conversation for a while and is now deciding whether to be relieved or cautious. "Regent Thorne," he said. "Indra," I said, "I want to talk to you about my sister." He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "All right." We stood in the corridor for 45 minutes. He answered every question I asked with the same quality his maintenance logs had, carefully, precisely, without either minimizing or dramatizing. He told me when he had started. He told me what had prompted it. The first time he had run the diagnostics on her pod and noted, in the maintenance record, that her baseline neural activity was registering on the high side of the expected cryo range, not dangerously so, just at the upper limit of what was normal. He had flagged it, received no response from the supervisor or the council medical liaison, and flagged it again. Still nothing. So he had done the thing that the training manuals did not cover and common sense suggested. He had started talking to her, on the theory that if her neural activity was registering at the upper limit, there was a chance, slim, unverified, the kind of chance you didn't put in a report, that something in there was listening. "Did you think it would help?" I asked. He thought about this. "I thought it probably didn't hurt," he said. "And I thought if she could hear anything, even just the sound of a voice, not content, just the fact of a human being standing there and talking, then she might have something to orient to, something to know she hadn't been put somewhere and left." I asked him what he talked about. "Whatever seemed worth saying," he said. "Things that were happening, what the weather was like on the upper levels, maintenance gossip, the kind that doesn't matter but fills a shift. I told her about a problem I was having with one of the other pods in the row once because I'd been thinking through the solution all morning and it was useful to say it out loud." A brief pause. "I told her about you sometimes, what I observed from the corridor when you came to visit, that you were still coming, that you hadn't stopped." I did not speak for a moment. "She should know that," he said simply, "if there was any chance she could know anything." I asked him if he had ever expected anything for it. He gave me a look that was not quite puzzlement and not quite amusement, a look that suggested the question had a premise he didn't recognize. "It's not that kind of thing," he said. I thanked him. He nodded once, picked up his diagnostic kit and went home. The council convened for what they believed would be a routine session in the 8th month, the last month before I was ready. I let them believe this until the vault technicians wheeled the thaw equipment into the chamber, and the council chair realized, at the same moment as most of the assembled court, that the regent had arranged for Usable Thorne's revival during a fully witnessed session of record. The medical team I had brought in, not the council's team, mine, sourced from outside the Varath system, had spent the previous 2 weeks preparing the thaw protocol. They were thorough. They were cautious. They had reviewed Kale Morrow's 7 years of maintenance records in detail and had told me privately that the neural baseline data was the most remarkable thing they had seen from a long-term cryo case. Whatever had been maintaining that upper-range activity over 7 years was anomalous. They did not use the word impossible, but they came close. The thaw took 4 hours. I sat. The council stood, most of them, because sitting would have required admitting this was going to take long enough to sit for. Kale Morrow sat in the back row of the observer section. I had asked him to be present, and he had come wearing a clean version of the same gray coverall diagnostic kit, nowhere in evidence, hands folded on his knees with the patience of someone accustomed to long waiting. When the stasis field shut down and the pod's shell separated at the seam, the medical team worked for another 20 minutes before they allowed anyone nearer. Then the lead medic looked at me and nodded once, not a dramatic nod, a professional one, the kind that means the preliminary signs are what we hoped. I went to the pod. Usable's eyes were open. That was the first thing. Her eyes were open and they were tracking, moving between my face and the ceiling, and the room with the slightly effortful deliberateness of someone coming back into their body from a long way away. She had not spoken yet. The medical team had warned me she might not speak for hours, possibly days, that the return from deep cryo was not like waking from sleep, but like reconstructing yourself from a pattern, piece by piece, the architecture reassembling before the inhabitant could move in. But she was looking at me, and I could see, watching her eyes, that she was already somewhere behind them. "Wise," I said. My voice did an embarrassing thing, I let it. She looked at me for a long time. Then her mouth moved small movements at first, the mechanism relearning itself. Then, with the careful effort of someone lifting something heavy. "Endra." That was all, just my name. But she said it the way you say a name when you have been saying it in your head for a very long time and have been waiting to find out if you would ever be able to say it out loud again. The medical team moved in. The council watched. I stepped back and pressed my hands together and let them work. It was another 2 hours before she was sitting upright with the diagnostic lead still attached and a heated blanket around her shoulders and a cup of something warm that she held with both hands and did not yet drink. The medical team was satisfied with what they were reading. The court was very quiet. The council chair had the expression of a man watching the door he has spent years bolting come off its hinges, not violently, but with a slow inevitability that is somehow worse. Usseval looked around the room with the deliberate taking stock of someone doing an inventory. She found the council members. She spent a measured moment on each of their faces. She found me. She held my eyes, and something passed between us that has no name and does not need one. Then her gaze moved across the room, methodical, careful, and found the back observer row. Found Cale Morrow, sitting where I had placed him, hands still folded, watching her the way he had watched a diagnostic readout for 7 years. Not with expectation, not with demand, with the patient attention of someone doing something that mattered regardless of the result. Her voice was still rough, still rebuilding itself, but it was clear. "Cale Morrow," she said. The room went silent in a different way than it had been silent before. The earlier quiet had been the silence of waiting. This was the silence of a room realizing it had missed something enormous. I had not told her his name. I had not had the chance to tell her anything. We had exchanged 12 words since she woke, 8 of which were my name and 4 of which were hers. The medical team had not told her. No one in that room had given her a briefing. She had known it because he had told her his name. On one of the first days, I assume, on one of those early visits when he had leaned on the railing and decided that if he was going to talk to someone, he ought to introduce himself first. And whatever they say about cryo-neural isolation, whatever the textbooks say about information retention during long-term stasis, Usseval Thorne had held Cale Morrow's name in her mind for 7 years. Through whatever darkness exists in that state. Through whatever disorientation comes from being put away like an inconvenient fact. She had held it the way you hold a lamp in a long corridor, not because the lamp is the destination, but because it's how you know you're still moving forward. He rose from his chair when she spoke his name, not because protocol required it. There was no protocol that covered this. He rose because she had spoken his name, and it seemed like the right thing to do when someone who has been carrying your name through 7 years of silence finally says it back to you. "Empress Thorne," he said. She looked at him for a long moment across the length of the room. This woman who had been frozen by her own court, who had woken to find her sister regent and her council waiting for the polished verdict of her incapacity, who had the long relearning of a body and a crown and a world ahead of her. She looked at him with the expression she gets when something has been confirmed rather than revealed, the expression of someone who was already certain and is now simply noting that the certainty was correct. "You talk to me every shift," she said. "I did," he said. "For 7 years." "Yes." She looked at him a moment longer. Then she said quietly to the room, "This man talked to me every shift for 7 years. when everyone else in this palace had either put me away or pretended I was already gone. I want that written into the record of today." The court scribe's stylus had been motionless for the past several minutes. It moved now. It was not a dramatic declaration. It was not, in the language of this niche, a roaring catchphrase. It was a statement of record, delivered in a voice still rough from 7 years of silence, by a woman who understood precisely what words placed in an official record could and could not be taken back. The council chair looked at his hands. 2 of the council members did not look at anything. The rest of the court looked at Kale Morrow the way they would spend the rest of that year learning to look at him, with the particular recalibration of people discovering that the thing they had dismissed as scenery had been, in fact, the most important element in the room. I crossed to where he was standing in the back row. I held out my hand. "I should have read your name patch years ago," I said. "I'm sorry I didn't." He took my hand briefly with the same practiced composure he brought to everything. "You came to visit her," he said. "Every fortnight. She knew that too." I had not considered, until that moment, that he had been telling my sister about my visits. That for 7 years, in those long, quiet intervals in the vault, the record of my presence had been part of what he gave her. That the 2 of us had, without ever coordinating, been keeping the same vigil from different distances. The council was dissolved and reformed over the following 3 months. This is not the story of that process. It was not clean, it was not quick, and several of the outcomes involved consequences that I will simply say were proportionate and leave it that. Usable let it. She was not, as the council had hoped, diminished by her 7 years in the vault. She was not disoriented or pliable or in need of guidance toward reasonable governance. She was exactly herself, sharper perhaps, for having had the long stillness in which to think without the noise of a court around her, and with a clarity of priority that came from having spent a significant portion of her life understanding what it meant to be put away and still brought back by the simple act of being spoken to. Kale Morrow did not leave the vault immediately. He finished his shift rotation, all 3 days of the remaining cycle, because, as he explained to the vault supervisor with the same dry practicality he applied to everything, the pod still needed maintaining regardless of what was happening upstairs. Usable officially added the role of Senior Cryosystems Advisor to the Palace Registry on the 4th day. The title was, I will admit, partly ceremonial. Vareth's seat does not have a great deal of cryo infrastructure beyond the vault, and the vault has since been substantially upgraded to equipment that requires considerably less manual attention. But it placed him in the official record. It gave him a standing that the court could read and navigate, and eventually, after a few months of adjustment, accept. It put his name in the document that mattered. She told me privately some of what he had said. Not all of it. I was right that some of it was not mine to have. But she told me the first thing he ever said to her, on the morning of his first shift on the old equipment rotation, before he had decided with certainty that he was going to keep doing this, when he was still in the testing stage of the decision. He had opened the maintenance check, logged the readings, and then leaned on the railing and said to the frozen sleeping woman in the pod, "I don't know if you can hear anything in there. I'm going to assume you can. My name is Kale Morrow. I'll be taking care of this pod. If you can hear me, everything up here is still going. Your sister came yesterday. She looked tired, but she came. I thought you should know that." That was the beginning of it. That was the small, practical, unmandated act of a maintenance technician who had decided that tending a pod meant tending the person inside it, and that the person inside it deserved to be treated as exactly that, a person, temporarily unavailable, who would want to know the world had not stopped while she was gone. 7 years is a long time to talk into silence and receive nothing back. There is a quality of faith in that which I do not have a better word for, not religious faith, not superstition, not sentiment exactly, but the grounded, workday faithful kind that shows up every shift and does the job because the job is worth doing whether or not the readout confirms it. He never expected to be thanked. He never expected to be heard. He had done it because the woman in the pod was still a person, and people deserved to be spoken to, and he happened to be the person standing there. When Usable was fully recovered, some 6 weeks after the thaw, by the medical team's assessment, I asked her what it had been like, what the 7 years had felt like from inside. She was quiet for a moment. We were on the upper terrace of Varath's seat, the city laid out below us in the late afternoon light, the kind of day that feels like something being handed back to you. It was like being in a very long room, she said finally, and it was dark and I didn't know where the end of the room was or if there was one, but there was a voice. She looked out at the city, not always, not continuously, but regularly. And the voice had a name. It told me its name on the first day, and the voice told me things that were happening, small things mostly. And because the small things kept changing, because it wasn't the same small things every time, I understood that time was passing, that I was still in time, that there was still a world out there producing new small things, and I was still connected to it by this voice. A pause. That's what kept me, not hope, not survival instinct. Just the fact that someone kept talking. I thought about Cale Morrow at his railing, in the blue-white light, with his diagnostic kit closed. He didn't know if you could hear him, I said. No, she said, but he talked anyway. She let that sit for a moment. Then she said, with the particular precision she uses when she wants something to be remembered exactly. That's the thing I want people to understand about what he did. It wasn't heroic, not in any way that makes a good story, not a rescue or a battle or a dramatic intervention. He just talked to someone who might not be able to hear him every shift for 7 years because that was the decent thing to do. That's all. But decent is the thing that holds. Decent is the thing that was waiting for me at the end of that long, dark room. She said it to me, and I remembered it, and I have said it here because it should be in a record somewhere, not the official one, which has dates and titles and the formal language of reinstatement, but the other kind of record. The kind that holds the weight of what actually happened. His name was Cale Morrow. He was a cryo-vault maintenance technician. He wore a gray coverall with a name patch I did not read for 4 years. He talked to my sister every shift for 7 years, and he brought her home. I am glad I finally read his name.